So this is our Q&A, and I always say you can ask anything. I do not promise I will answer anything, but feel free to ask any questions tonight. Yeah.
So, in Gemaras, we see many times Amoraim and Tanaim arguing over seemingly mitzias questions. So I was wondering, when do we say that Amoraim and Tanaim argue on mitzias, as well as Rishonim? When do Rishonim argue on mitzias, if they do at all? I know Rebbe's brought up before a Rashi that says that there are times when they do argue mitzias, but is there like some sort of clause that we can have that can tell us when it's okay, when it's not? Also, Basil wrote on science, which kind of says there's no such thing as mitzias, to an extent.
Yeah. So let me just formulate the question a little bit more detailed, so you'll understand the difficult question that's being raised. Obviously, when you have a machlokas about what the halacha is, right? So that we understand. There's a machlokas. People are looking at the yisodos of a din, and they argue how you would apply it in a given situation. And even if they say opposite things, one says kosher, one says treif, one says tameh, one says tahor, analytically that is not so difficult because HaKadosh Baruch Hu created a process, and as long as the chachamim are authorized chachamim, that's a big question, who's authorized, and as long as they're following the rules of the system, so even if they're wrong, Hashem says that's okay, that's right. That's the way Halakha works. So when you stamazai have a machlekes in Halakha, we apply the rule, the famous principle, Elu v'elu divrei Elokim chayim. They are both correct. And even then, people raise the question, how can they be both correct if one says chayav and one says patra? But the answer is, they're both correct because if they are outcomes of the halachic process, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is makabel at his emes. But even that's a difficult idea, but that's a well-accepted concept. But that works out well when you have a machlokas in halacha. Then you could say God will accept either answer. It's like in a math problem. I don't know if you ever had teachers like this, but there are professors who will give you full credit for process, even if your bottom line answer is wrong, but you did the right process. But what about when you have a machlokas in mitzias? One person said this happened, and one person says this happened, or they're describing science. This happened, this happened. Now there, it's not shayach anymore to say Elu v'elu divrei Elokim chayim, both of them are correct, because it either happened or it didn't happen, right? How can they both be correct? So I did mention, as you say, a Rashi, the Taka says, that in a machlokas in mitzias, one will be right and one will be wrong. Meaning, say, in achinami, the notion that they're both right is only shayach in a machlokas in halacha. It is not shayach in a machlokes in mitzias. Now, the implication of that Rashi is, not like Rav Meiselman, there is such a thing as a machlokes in mitzias. The only thing is, we don't say, Elu v'elu divrei Elokim chayim. I'll give you one example of machlokes in mitzias. Although I'll give you a possible answer for that. Right, there is a din in the Torah called a ben sorer u'morer. We're going to read about it in 2 weeks. So this is a rebellious son that if he commits certain crimes with certain conditions, he is actually put to death, even though he's not bar mitzvah. He's only 12 years old. So according to one Mandi Amar, lo hoya v'lo nivra, there never was such a thing. There never was in human history an example of a kid who was put to death under the rules of ben sorer u'morer. Right, so it never happened. Another rabbi says, it did happen, and I sat on his grave. I was next to his grave. So one Mandi Amar said, there is no such thing, it never happened, and the other says, I was there. That's a machlokas in mitzias, right? Now, you can't say, Elu v'elu divrei Elokim chayim, although I'll give you a possible way there, right? So again, two questions. So if you ask me, do Tanoim, do Amoraim, do even Rishonim, do even Achronim argue over mitzias? I think the answer is fairly clear that they do. But we don't say Elu v'elu divrei Elokim chayim on such a machlokas and therefore we have to determine who is right and who is wrong. Now, it is also the case, however, that whenever possible, we try to avoid making it a machlokas and metzias, precisely because once you lower something into the realm of physical metzias, you're going to be dealing with right and wrong, and we don't want to be in a position where we have to say a Tana is wrong. So usually, and again, you have to approach, you have to literally go through every example of metzias that you have, but usually, when there's a machlokes in metzias, seemingly a machlokes in metzias, one of the ways you look at it is, they're not arguing over the metzias, they're arguing over what percentage of the metzias should make a difference la halacha. Meaning, let's say that Mandi Amar says, we make a gezerah that don't do this because maybe you'll do this. And the other person says, people never do that. Machlokas and Metzias. But one way of understanding it is, well, 1% of the people do that. So the one that's gozer is machshiv the 1%, and the one that's not gozer says we ignore the 1%. So you're not making it a machlokas and Metzias, you're making it a machlokas of how much of the Metzias should make a difference. So when you can do that, we try to do that, because that way we've turned a machlokas into Metzias into a machlokas and din. But sometimes it's unavoidable. So I'm not sure, I'm familiar with Rav Meiselman's book on Judaism and science. I'm not familiar with his statement, there's no such thing as a machlokas and Metzias. I think that's very, very difficult, but I'm sure he explains what he meant. Now, there's another aspect of a machlokas and Metzias, and that is, this is actually a hesber of the Gra on Eilu v'Eilu divrei Elokim Chayim. And the Gra says the following, a little different than the way I said a while ago, in which, as long as you follow the halachic process, Hashem validates all outcomes. And that's what I said earlier. The Gra says a little bit of a different explanation. The Gra says that whenever you have a machlokas, there's some underlying svara in which they're arguing. One Mandi Amar is utilizing a certain svara to come to a certain conclusion. And another Mandi Amar is utilizing a different svara to come to the conclusion. So Eilu v'Eilu divrei Elokim Chayim, the Gra says, is, even if a given svara is inoperative here, because we follow the other opinion, it will pop up elsewhere. Right? You know in learning, right, that often a certain svara, which we may not paskin like in Hilchos Shabbos, may somehow make an appearance in Hilchos Gittin, where it does have a validity. Which means the MS is MS, but it may not be an MS in this particular context. So in a machlokas and metzias too, it may work in a kind of a complicated way, that the underlying svara that led a person to view the metzias in a certain way may be incorrect in this context, but it still has a kiyum in some other place in Torah. Okay? Now, let me give you another answer for in the actual case of Ben Sorah Umorah, right? That I think is a classic machlokas and metzias, where one Mandi Amar says it never happened, and the other Mandi Amar said it happened and I was there. So here's one way you can look at it. There are machloksim about what are the conditions for Ben Sorah Umorah. So it could be that a given Sanhedrin executed a kid based on the conditions that they maintained you need, but the other Mandi Amar says you need more conditions which were not satisfied, which means everybody's moda, this kid was stoned by a Beis Din. In other words, they're not arguing over the Metzias, but the one that says Lo Haya V'Lo Nivra is saying the Beis Din made a mistake in executing the guy because the conditions weren't met, and the other Mandi Amar says the conditions were met. See, that's very different. So you're taking what looks like a machlokas in Metzias, and you're actually turning it into a machlokas in dinim. You see, meaning they're not arguing if the kid was killed. They're arguing, was the kid that was killed a Ben Sorah Umorah or was he not a ben Sora Amora? Okay, but you're right. We do try to minimize machlokas and mitzias. Now, I'm not addressing, although I think obliquely you were moving in that direction, I'm not addressing the very, very interesting and difficult question if Chazal make mistakes when they make scientific statements. Right? We have amunas chachamim. Right? We are makabel Chazal in matters of halacha. But when Chazal makes scientific statements, for example, the Gemara in Sukkah, why do eclipses happen? Because God is punishing the world for various averos, even though we know eclipses are predictable phenomena, or the like. So the question of how do you deal with Gemaras or Mishnayos or whatever that seem to contradict scientific understandings, this is a huge, huge, huge issue. There is a tradition going back to Rav Hai Gaon and later the Rambam, that in matters of science, Chazal were speaking as scientists. They were not speaking as the Balei Messiah of Torah Shebal Peh. And although they were learned scientists, but science can be corrected and science can be changed. And therefore the statements of Chazal regarding science are not necessarily authoritative. Then you have Rabbi Meiselman, whose book is designed to go the other direction, that everything Chazal say is emes. So I'm not going to go into that other than saying that the truth of the matter is the balance of Makairis actually favor the idea that in matters of science, Chazal are not definitive. And that is why when the Rambam gives us health advice, the Rambam does not give us the Gemara's health advice. The Rambam gives us his own health advice because the Rambam maintained that the Gemara itself was subject to change based on medical science. Where things so we have this dichotomy. When it comes to Halakha, Chazal are correct. When it comes to science, Chazal may or may not be correct because that could change with the understandings of wisdom. So that's a good dichotomy. But then you get into a problem. What happens when you have halachas that are based on scientific assumptions, which seemingly are not true scientific assumptions? Does that change the halakha? The most famous example is killing a kina. A kina is a louse. So the Gemara in Shabbos says that even though one of the 39 malachos is killing an animal, netilas neshama, but you're allowed to kill lice on Shabbos because the issur of netilas neshama is only for species that reproduce by Zohar or nekeva, sexual reproduction, and lice do not produce by sexual reproduction. Lice produce by what is called spontaneous generation. That means the rotting of matter, organic matter like meat or whatever it would be, and memela, there's no issue of netilas neshama. Now, spontaneous generation, the notion that life comes out of decaying organic matter, was a common belief. It was the belief of the Romans, the Babylonians, etc., because after all, they saw in their own observation, when meat rots, you get a lot of flies or whatever it is, and they looked at it as spontaneous generation. But with the invention of microscopes in the 1600s, it was determined that there actually is no such thing, seemingly, as spontaneous generation. And even lice reproduce sexually, Mr. and Mrs. Louse, whatever it would be. So here's the question. Chazal mattered killing a kina based on the assumption of spontaneous generation. But if that scientific fact turns out to be untrue, then l'chaira, I should no longer have a heter to kill lice. See, bishlama, if Chazal's mistake was to be more machmir, so it's shaykh to say, okay, listen, Chazal answered something, so even though the reason doesn't make sense to us, we're bound by the chumrah. But this example is very striking, because this is an example where the seeming mistake in science matired a malacha de'oraisa that would otherwise be usher. So if you're telling me Chazal have finality in halacha, but their scientific judgments are subject to revision, what is the impact of a revised scientific judgment on a halacha that was based on the original scientific assumption that has now proven to be incorrect? That's a huge machlokus. In the Sefer Pachad Yitzchak, from Rabbi Yitzchak Lamperanti, this is not Rav Hutner's Pachad Yitzchak, this is a Pachad Yitzchak from the 17th century, the 1600s. It was like an encyclopedia of halacha, Pachad Yitzchak, shortly after the invention of the microscope. So the Pachad Yitzchak says, now that we know that even lice reproduce sexually, it is usher to kill lice on Shabbos min ha-Torah, which means, according to what he's saying, Chazal that mattered it were Mechavol Shabbos. That's what he says. Rev Dessler articulates what might be called a very mystical theory of halacha. And Rev Dessler says that Chazal did not always give all the reasons for dinim. And he even says, and perhaps Chazal were not aware of all the reasons. There's kind of a Ruach HaKodesh that guides them to the right answer. And then they try to formulate a reason or a svara. But even if that reason or svara is disproven, that does not change the hachra of the chachamim. Because in other words, if you're asking me, well, why are you allowed to kill lice on Shabbos? Rav Dessler would say, well, we used to think this was the reason. They're not parvarava mizachur nekeva. Now we don't know the reason, but there's still a reason. I have to admit, I have a tremendous problem with this notion of hidden reasons for halacha, because it would seem to make psak halacha impossible. Because all psak halacha is based on analogy. Right? The Gemara gives you certain cases. So you try to say, this case is like that case. But that only works if I could trust that the reason that's given is the actual reason. Then I can say, oh, well, that reason applied there, so that reason applies here. Once you go with Rav Dessler, that there may be all sorts of unknown reasons for things, then I don't know how you could do analogical reasoning from one case to another, because maybe this case is different for reasons that are not stated. So the mystical theory of halacha, I think, is very, very problematical, but Rav Dessler suggests it. The Chazon Ish has another approach, which is actually very pragmatic. The Chazon Ish, at least in this particular case, looks at what is called Niker L'Yayin. We know that halacha is not necessarily based on objective reality. Halacha is based on perceptible reality. For example, you're not allowed to eat bugs, right? Everyone is not allowed to eat bugs, shrutzim. So, the problem is, I don't want to take away your appetite, but if you took a piece of bread and you put it under a powerful microscope, I really shouldn't tell you this, but maybe you know it anyway, you would see all sorts of disgusting things that you're not allowed. Number one, you wouldn't want to eat, but even halachically, you're not allowed to eat. Rat hairs and this and that, all sorts of treif. Even breathing, right? That's why there's this religion in India. They wear face masks even pre-COVID because they don't want to breathe in some insect that they might kill, a microbe, bacteria. Elamai, why don't we have a problem? Because the Torah doesn't asher insects unless they are visible to the naked eye. Anything that's not visible to the naked eye is not nichlal in the Yisur of Shratzim. That's an important klal. Now, the reason we're machmer when we check lettuce is that many poskim say, if you can see the dark spot, even though you can't identify it as an insect, that's called Niker L'Yayin. Some say not, by the way. Some say if it doesn't look like an insect, you could be making, we're no way to be machmer. But things you can't see at all by the naked eye, even if you could see it under a microscope, it's not going to be usher. Tefillin is another example. The base of the tefillin has to be square. Now, square means each side is a 90-degree angle. Now, if you took a compass or some type of measuring device, you might see your tefillin are slightly off kilter, 91 degrees or whatever it would be. But the halacha is, if the normal visual observation looks square, I'm not mechuyev to measure it in a scientifically precise manner. So the Chazon Ish says, when Chazal made the statement that a kina is not pareh v'raveh, mizachar nekeva, they weren't referring to the objective mitzias. Maybe objectively, they knew this. They knew it was pareh v'raveh, mizachar nekeva. But it's not something that's visually perceptible. So the Chazon Ish says, that halacha says, that based on the notion of nikr li'ayin, so that's not going to change. Even if science has different understandings based on microscopes and magnification, it's still a mitzias that the Zohar nekeva chibur is not nikr li'ayin. So that's how the Chazon Ish understands. Again, that doesn't explain every machlokas of science and halacha, but this is an approach. So that's a vast argument. But as I say, I think it's clear there are machlokim in mitzias, but we try to minimize them when we can. I'm sorry for the very long answer. Yeah.
So the question is regarding the mechanism in which an individual adopts a minhag, so, and the repercussions. So is the minhag adopted, say, from the parent or from the father because it's their father and they get what their father has, or is it because their father taught them something and because they started doing it that way, the doing it is what adopts it? For example, if someone does tshuva and they decide, okay, I'm going to keep 6 hours between meat and milk, and then their father does tshuva and they decide to go with the Amsterdam minhag and keep 1 hour, can I, or that person or whoever, go to keeping 1 hour after their father adopts a different minhag?
Yeah, that actually is a very excellent question. We commonly say that a person should follow, assuming their parent were shomer mitzvahs, you follow the minhagim of your father. And there's even a pasuk that is cited, a pasuk in Hazinu, Sha'al avicha b'yagetcha, which quite literally means, ask your father and he will tell you. However, it's not really clear that halachically there is any obligation at all to follow the minhagim of your father. Part of why you're chayav to follow the minhagim of your father is if you simply already did it, it becomes like a vow, it becomes like a neder when you do a mitzvah 3 times. But according to that svara, you could have hataras nedarim and then become Sephardi or whatever it is. And Ashkenazi is allowed to be Sephardi even, right? If you wanted to be totally Sephardi, I mean, you can't pick and choose. Like, you can't have, I like rice on Pesach, so I'll be Sephardic for that and whatever. And I'll only say Shlichos. That's the dilemma, right? A person decides Ashkenaz or Sfard. So let's see. The Sfard advantage is I get to eat rice on Pesach, but I got to get up for Slichos like every day of Rosh Chodesh Elul, from Rosh Chodesh Elul. So, of course, and if I'm Sephardi, I can marry 2 wives. That may be a Milo or a Chisorin. I'm not sure. So you can't pick and choose. I think it's fairly clear, although that's not so pashut, why not? But generally speaking, we don't allow picking and choosing. But on the other hand, you are permitted to be meshana from the minhagim of your father, al pi hataras nedarim. So it's called a neder, which actually means, according to that svara, there is no binding obligation to follow the minhagim of your father. You're simply bound by it initially, because if you started that way, as most people will start, it became a neder, and therefore you need the grounds of hataras nedarim. And now that may be different. There is a difference in the minhagim of your father versus the minhagim of your community. The minhagim of your community may be more chamor, but even today, many say that we don't really have single communities, meaning in every Jewish city, there are many different kehilos, Ashkenazim, Sfardim, different types of Ashkenazim, Yetis, Litvaks, Galicianers, and different types of Sfardim, Moroccans, Tunisians, etc. So the notion that you're mechuyev to follow the minhagim of the makom, which is halachically valid, and you wouldn't necessarily be allowed to escape it via hataras nedarim, actually doesn't apply today because every makom is comprised of many, many different things. So I knew a person very chashuv Talmid Chacham. He was the mashgiach in Yeshivat Porat Yosef, which was the largest, at the time, the largest Sephardic yeshiva. And he was, a bona fide, dyed-in-the-wool Ashkenazi, for sure. And he totally became Sephardi. He says he's a mashgiach in a Sephardic yeshiva. I assume, I never asked him, I assume he did Hataras Nidorim, and he was Meshanet. Now, the reason why this is important to know is because it also has some very practical implications. Let's say you're a Baal Tshuva, right? So let's assume that your father was not keeping all of the mitzvahs. So sometimes people assume as a gut reaction, well, if my father came from Germany, or my grandparents came from Germany, or whatever it would be, I gotta do the German Minhagim. I gotta do the Yeki Minhagim. That's my makam. The answer is no, you don't. Because if you're a Baal Tshuva, you are not bound by Minhag HaMakom, because there is no single makam. I mean, you're not, and you can actually choose whatever you want to be. You can choose Chasidus, you can choose Yeki, Litvak, you could even choose Sephardi, as I indicated that way. A ger for sure can do that. A ger, that's a davar pashut, but even a Baal Tshuva who's Jewish, who was born Jewish, could actually choose. Now, it is brought down that just maybe as a matter of kibud av, or as a matter of kibud for your grandparents, it's a factor to think about. But it vaday is not a chiyuv. You are not mechuyev to go back to what your great-grandparents did and the like. So in your particular example, where the father did tshuva after the son, but went with a different minhag, it's almost clear, I think it's very clear, that the son should stay with 6 hours. Because the heter to do 1 hour, whatever it is only if that was the minhag of your makam, not if your father happened to take that on, or whatever. And by the way, because of this, it's important to understand that a Baal Tshuva is not bound by the first set of minhagim they happen to encounter. A very classic example, and again, I am absolutely not anti-Chabad. I actually love Chabad. Some of my best friends are Chabad. But it happens to be that many people's first entry point into Judaism is Chabad. And they deserve a tremendous amount of credit for that. Okay, so a person takes on Lebavatra Minhagim. He then comes to Ohr Somayach that will torture you to renounce, your whatever it will be. So the question becomes, well, I was makabel Chabad Minhagim, so how can I leave Chabad Minhagim? Now, I'm not saying, by the way, I am not at all saying you have to leave Chabad Minhagim. If you want to stay with Chabad Minhagim, that's perfectly fine. I'm not here at all to say that. But all I'm saying is that as you learn and as you get exposed to different things, you can change your orientation with Hataras Nidorim and the like. So a Baal Tshuva is not going to be stuck in whatever minhagim they were first exposed to. They will have the capacity to change as they move. Again, I'll say the same thing is true with the opposite. Let's assume that you started with Ohr Somayach and then you went to Mayanot or whatever it would be. Same thing. I mean, you could go into Chabad minhagim from Ashkenazic minhagim. Okay, so the truth is there is not really a chiyuv to follow the minhagim of a parent. It just has a din of a neder, a kabbalah or mitzvah, for which you have Hataras Nidorim.
The option though, like out of kavod.
For sure it is. And often we might advise it. I'll give you a very interesting example of this. It's a different context, but it's a very interesting example. I don't know if anyone here is from Baltimore. Anyone from Baltimore? Okay, so Baltimore has an old yucky shul, German shul. It's called the Glen Avenue Synagogue, whatever. And Glen Avenue was started by very devout Yekis, like Washington Heights type Yekis, in which, a Yeki, the Machzor on Yom Kippur has 1,000 pages. They read page 1 to 1,000. I mean, every page in the Machzor, is said. Right? Nothing is skipped. And what happened was that, unfortunately, the younger yeshiva-educated element doesn't like these long. Again, maybe that's a criticism, but Lamaisa, it happens to be that yeshivish people like a shorter davening. They want to learn, whatever. Again, I'm not even saying it's good, but that's the Metzias. So this old Yeki Shul was losing the youth, losing the next generation who were going to different yeshivas and minyanim. So as a result, the Yeki Shul came to a decision that we have to change. We have to kind of do a regular Ashkenazic shul as opposed to the Yeki Minhag of page 1 to 1,000 on Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and not just them, but all sorts of intermediate Shabbos. They have Yotzros and Piyutim, all sorts of things that you've never even heard of. I mean, you're not even going to see it in the Art Scroll Siddur, all sorts of things. So the problem was the old timers were still alive, like, the 90-year-old guys, and they said, hey, this is our show, we started the show, and this is the way it is. So they went to Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and they asked the Shaila, if a shul was founded based on a certain nusach, and there are still people who are makpid that we do the original nusach, but a majority wants to change to something else, is the majority permitted to overrule the minority of the people who want to keep the original nusach? It's an interesting shaila. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach paskins, the minhagim of a shul can always be changed by a majority of the mispalalim. They have the absolute right. They could change it to Svardik if they wanted. There is no concept that because the shul was founded in a certain way, it has to be that way always. But Rav Shlomo Zalman suggested, for kavod, for the original members, they should selectively incorporate some of the old German minhagim that would not create a tircha de tzibura for the people who wanted a shorter davening. So Rav Shlomo Zalman told the committee from this show, Glen Avenue show, they should make a list of 100 minhagim, and he would go over like what was considered acceptable. So it was very, very interesting. So the Glen Avenue show stopped being a full nusach Ashkenaz, meaning a German nusach, but they selectively have things that are not time-consuming, like they'll use the wimple, they'll do Galila a certain way, they'll use a certain niggin for Kaddish, right? So that was an example of you're allowed to change the minhag, but you still have a certain kavod for the original. So that would be kind of an analogy of following your father's minhagim and the like. Okay? Yeah.
Similar Indian, what would be your argument for Ashkenazim to eat machpud meat in the
Yeah, so this is a little controversial. I don't want to get in trouble. The issue in Eretz Yisrael of Ashkenazim relying on hashkachos that are coming from Sephardic rabbis. Bet Yosef is one example. Machpud is another example. Because I'm going to plead the Fifth Amendment, I'm not going to give endorsements one way or the other. But suffice to say, in the hierarchy of hashkachot, Machpud is regarded as a higher level than even Bet Yosef. So even people who might not, Ashkenazim, who might not do Bet Yosef, many will do Machpud. Again, I'm not endorsing, I'm just reporting a common mitzias. But the question still becomes, Machpud is a Sephardi or Temani, actually. So the question is, why? How can Ashkenazi rely upon it? So the truth of the matter is, you need to do a much, much closer investigation, meaning the claim of the Sephardic Mahadran Hashkachas, and I don't have a reason to doubt their claim, is that they are incorporating the chumras of both Ashkenazim and Sephardim, meaning because they want to, which makes business sense actually, because they want to market their product to the entire population. So they will incorporate whatever chumras Ashkenazim have, whatever chumras Sephardim have, so Ashkenazim and Sephardim can eat the shechita. That is the claim of both Bet Yosef and Machpud. The empirical issue is, how much do you trust that? Again, I'm not going to express an opinion on that, but many, many people feel that Rav Machpud in particular is a very honest Talmid Chacham, and he says he's doing what Ashkenazim need as well. And there's no particular reason why I shouldn't believe him. This is Eid Echad, Neman B'Serms. That would be the basis of it. Yeah.
One is definitely encouraged to pray to Hashem, right, and ask for things from Hashem during
Yeah.
davening. At the same time, there's also the idea that the more the benefit you get in this world, the less benefit you have in Olam Haba. So does this create a dilemma where if Hashem was to answer your prayers and give you all those things that you're asking for, let's say He gives you this and that, and let's say you pray for money, He gives you that, parnasah, and makes your life very easy, does that mean your Olam Haba is not going to be affected by that? So at the same time, is there now like an opinion that maybe you shouldn't ask for too much in davening?
No, that's a very, very excellent question, right? Because on one hand, the person suffers in this world, so we say, oh, all of the suffering in this world means you'll get more reward in Olam Haba. If you get reward in this world, your Olam Haba is diminished. So the question becomes, why do I pray for good things? Why do I pray for money? I pray for parnasa. I pray for health. I mean, if all of these good things become the reward for my mitzvot, that means I lose out in Olam Haba. So l'chayra, maybe a person is better off with a hard life than they are with a blessed life in that way. So why do I daven? Right, all of our davening is for good things. Give us refuah, give us parnasa, give us children, and the like. So I think it is a very good question, but I think the simple answer is the notion that the reward you get in this world comes out of your Olam Haba is true only if it's a reward that you don't use to serve Hashem. Meaning to say, Hashem blesses me with wealth and I don't use it to serve Hashem. So then Hashem says, okay, we count that as your reward and it comes out of your Olam Haba account. But lehepech, it's kind of a business expense, right? If an employer gives you money and tells you to use it for the business, that doesn't come out of your salary, right? That's a business expense. So when Hashem gives me rewards that I use to serve Hashem, so that doesn't come out of my reward. That's an expense of God's business. Masha ein kain, if I'm just using it for my own personal benefit, then ein achinami. There may be a problem that Hashem says, oh, you're not using it to serve me. You're using it for your own personal gratification. So you're taking your reward. You're taking an advance on your salary. So that's going to come out of your benefit. So that might be the chiluk, that when we use our gashmias for ruchnias, it becomes Hashem's cost. It doesn't become our cost, and therefore it doesn't come out of our reward. That might be one possible answer. Yeah.
What is the validity of Zohar?
Yeah, validity of Zohar. So historically, it's a complicated question. Again, let me give you just a little bit of the basic, simple history. The Zohar was, we generally believe, we say the Zohar was authored by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who was a Talmid of Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai lived in the 2nd century, meaning in the 100s, meaning around the time, shortly after the Churban Beis Hamikdash. And yet, the Zohar was not discovered until 1,000 years later in the 1200s by a great Makubal, Rav Moshe de Leon, who discovered this manuscript in a cave. And he was the one that said, this is the teaching of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and that became the Zohar. Now, ever since that happened, there has been an ongoing controversy. Is the Zohar truly the work of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, but it was hidden because the world was not ready for it? Or was it the work of Rav Moshe de Leon, who's trying to pass it off? This is reverse plagiarism. See, the plagiarism we're familiar with is when I take somebody else's book and I put it under my name. But there's also a phenomenon the other way, where people would write books and they would put a great person's name on it, reverse plagiarism, in order for it to be accepted. So the argument goes, is the Zohar the work of Rav Moshe de Leon? Now, it's still an old book. That's still the 1200s, but it's not Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So it's a big, big machlokas. Rav Yaakov Emden, for example, took the position that the Zohar was the work of Rav Moshe de Leon. And there's all sorts of stories of Moshe de Leon's wife. But again, some of these are Rebbe Mises, because there were misnagdim to the Zohar people who were opposition, and they said, yeah, the wife said, my husband told me he forged the whole thing. They have mice, and he forged the whole thing because he felt his own Kabbalistic writings were not appreciated, because we have Svarim for Moshe de Leon in his own name. They weren't appreciated, so he said he was going to do something in the name of Shimon Bar Yochai that everybody would admire. Okay. So this is a controversy in the academic world. Many do ascribe it to Moshe de Leon. But all I can say is that the Gra, the Vilna Gaon, the Arizal, Rav Moshe Cordovero, the Ramchal, they all were makabel that the Zohar is the work of Rav Shimon Bar Yochai. So historically, maybe it's a mystery, but the great Gedolei Yisrael have treated it as the work of Rav Shimon Bar Yochai. Now, I do want to point out, though, that even like the view that the Zohar is Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, even like that view, that does not mean every line in the Zohar is Rav Shimon Bar Yochai. The Zohar quotes Amoraim who lived after Rav Shimon Bar Yochai. So the same way that we say, for example, that David HaMelech wrote Tehillim, but the Gemara itself says that there were 10 contributors to the book of Tehillim, meaning David HaMelech wrote the core of Tehillim, but there were Tehillim written by other people, Moshe Rabbeinu, Adam Harishon, etc. So too, it's a Dover Pasha that even if I go with the Gra and the Arizal and the Ramchal and the Ramak, Rav Moshe Cordovero, that the Zohar is Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, that's the core of the Zohar. There are Vadai Hosafas that came later. That's L'chulei Alma. Okay? But as I say, they were makabel that the core of the Zohar is from Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Yeah.
Regarding a couple of parashas ago, it said that Ohr Somayach was lecturing the Jewish people and saying, don't think that you are going into the land because of your own personal merit. It's because of two things: because of the zechut of the avot, and also the sins of the inhabitants. Right? And the Torah describes that the inhabitants, the Canaanites, they were rabid idolaters, and they were also doing fire sacrifices, throwing their kids into the fire from Moloch. So and that's why they deserve to be destroyed. And then, so now, of course, when it comes to messianic redemption and the Jews yet return back to the land, then the same question is now asked about the inhabitants of the land, Eretz Yisrael, prior to the Jews. In fact, you could argue that it's already started to happen. So you had the inhabitants now starting to get displaced again. The only problem is that, the kasha is that when it came to the new inhabitants, the Ishmaelites, right, is that what thing did they do that caused their displacement to be deserved, their displacement to be displaced, since you could argue that they have more of a zechut than the Canaanites, since they are followers of Hashem, and not only that, but their violent anti-Semitism only started in reaction to the Zionist movement, not creating.
Okay, that's a controversial issue. Well, it is very true that the Bnei Yishmael have certain spiritual zechuyos. That's very, very true. They have the zechus of bris milah that Yishmael practiced and they incorporated. They have zechus of tznius. They have zechus of prayer. In fact, I see that terrorist groups quote me online. They took out some. When I once elaborated on this a little bit, I don't want to elaborate it too much because I don't want to see on YouTube, Rabbi says Arabs are righteous, whatever. I don't want to move in that direction. But it is true that Bnei Yishmael have certain zechuyos that make them very, very difficult to defeat. But the thing is that Hashem did promise to Avraham Avinu that Am Yisrael will have this land. So at some point, the issue of the rishus of the goyim may determine the timing of when Hashem will keep his promise, but the promise has to be kept. And as we approach Mashiach at that point, the merit of Yishmael is going to become less important because it's going to be superseded by the promise. Did you see this? This is so outrageous. There was some reform service somewhere, which was an anti-Israel thing. They were protesting the massacre in Gaza. So for some reason, they were reading the Torah. Okay, they had a female Baal Koreh, but So she's reading these psukim about how God says to Avram, those who bless you will be blessed, etc. And then, when it came to the verse, and I have given you the land forever, the Baal Koreh like mumbled it, like almost skips it. So she's like, the person like laning real loud, and when it came to, and the land shall be yours forever, and then, she began singing everything else again. It's like you just take the verses out of the Torah. You just ignore, you make believe, you're ashamed. You're ashamed of the Torah saying that the Jewish people are connected to Eretz Israel. So, in a sense, therefore, Hashem is saying it's not our merit, but ultimately it has to happen. I mean, there may be two reasons that the Torah gave there, but Lagabi Mashiach, all you need is the reason of Zechus Avos. Zechus Avos and the bris Avos is going to be enough to bring the Geula. Yeah.
So 2 questions. Number 1, what's going on with Rashi al-Harif, and how do you use that with the Rashi on the Gemara? And number 2, similarly by Taisvis, what do you do with combining Taisvis across Shas? Because there are different Bali Taisvis. So do you generally try to combine them, or are you okay saying that?
Yeah. So Rashi on the Rif, again, it's a very, very simple point. The Rif, Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi, wrote essentially a kitzer of Shas, meaning he goes through the Masechtas that are Nogea L'maisa, not Kutshim, but the Masechtas that are Nogea L'maisa, and he summarizes them. So what might be 5 blot of Gemara might only be a blot of the Rif. In fact, it's a very good way of chazering a Masechta. People don't use the Rif as a tool for chazara, but it's a very excellent way of chazara. Now you'll see, in addition to the Ran and other commentaries, there's something called Rashi, right? Rashi al-Rif. So the short answer is there is no such thing. Rashi did not write, although the Rif was before Rashi, but Rashi did not write a commentary on the Rif. Rashi on the Rif is simply the action of some anonymous editor or printer who was malakate from Rashi on the daf of the Gemara and put it on whatever language of the Rif corresponds to that particular Gemara. And then what happens occasionally is that Sofrim used to add their own notes. When they would copy a text, they would add some notes. So they added, so you'll see, there will be things in Rashi al-Rif that are not in the Gemara, but they are not from Rashi. They are Hosafos of Matikim, Hosafos of copyists. The original Rashi al-Rif was simply taken from Rashi on the Gemara, put on the Rif, and then Matikim may have added a little bit. Now with Tosfos, this is actually very, very, very interesting. The word Tosfos, of course, just means additional notes. And these are really additional notes to Rashi. In the aftermath of Rashi, that was founded first in France, mainly in France, and then in Germany. The yeshivos that are known as the yeshivos of the Balei HaTosfos. And there are many, many different collections of Tosfos. A lot of them overlap. The different questions and answers and pilpulim were compiled in different yeshivos and by different rabbis. So there's Tosfos Harash. There's Tosfos Shantz. Shantz is a city in France. There is Tosfos Rabbeinu Peretz. Right? You'll see a lot of Sfarim that are called Tosfos, because these are the compilations of the Balei HaTosfos. Now, there's a lot of overlap, because these yeshivas were focusing on the same questions and the same answers, but each one had different styles and different mahalchim a little bit. That's why sometimes if you don't understand the Tosfos, you look at the Tosfos Harash, who may have a little more explanation of the Tosfos. So, the first printers of Shas faced a very, very difficult issue. And imagine, they want to put something, in fact, the first printers of Shas were Goyim. Daniel Bomberg was a Goy, but he was a sharp businessman. It didn't make sense to print books for Goyim, because most Goyim didn't know how to read. So if you wanted to make money in the book business, you printed books for Jews. Right? So that's why the first printers were Christian, and they made money printing books for Yidden, because the Goyim B'chlal didn't know how to read, so there was no point in printing books for Goyim. So Now, obviously, people like Bomberg had to hire Jewish copyists, Jewish scribes, Jewish editors. I mean, Bomberg didn't know how to read Hebrew, but he had a good eye for hiring people. And imagine if you were an editor, right? You applied for a job. You're a Kailo guy, you're looking for Parnassa. So Daniel Bomberg hires you in whatever, 1450, I don't have the exact years, you will work in his printing press. And your job, I mean, imagine how he create a Gemara. It was really heavy. Your job is to be in charge of Maseches Brachos. So you got to look at the manuscripts, different manuscripts of Gemara, manuscripts of Rashi. When it comes to Tosfos, you actually may have several different manuscripts of Tosfos to choose from. Should I do this one, Tosfos Harash, Tosfos Shantz, Tosfos Rabbeinu Peretz? Which one should, right? So choices were made. Now, I can't fully explain why certain choices were made, but what it works is, and we have sworn that you should document this. Each Maseches often has a different collection of Tosfos. Meaning one Maseches, the Tosfos on the daf may be Rabbeinu Peretz. In another Maseches, it may be Tosfos Harash. In another Maseches, it may be Tosfos Shantz. And there's Tosfos Toch. There are quite a few, like 20 different ones. Because of this, it is makubal that you can never ask stiras between Tosfos. You can never say Tosfos contradicts. Now, the exception to that is when a particular person is mentioned. If you have a teretz b'shem Rabbeinu Tam, and that contradicts something else Rabbeinu Tam said, or the Ri said, so you could ask a kasha. But even then, you could answer that it's like Trei Tanoi Aliba de Rabbi Meir, meaning to say, well, Tosfos Shantz had one version of Rabbeinu Tam, and Tosfos Rabbeinu Peretz had a different version of Rabbeinu Tam. So even within the Ri and Rabbeinu Tam, you can't really ask a stira unless it's in one Masechta, because typically, one collection of Tosfos is for a whole Masechta. But when it's different Masechtas, even among the same person, you can't ask the kasha. And Kal V'chomer, when it's a stam Tosfos without a speaker, the speaker would be Rabbeinu Peretz, it would be Rabbeinu Shimshon, it would be the Rush, etc. So you can't ask stiris and Tosfos. So the notion of trying to reconcile a stiris and Tosfos is l'chayra not anything that's necessary. I mean, it's always good to ask yourself, is there a stira? I mean, that is worthwhile because you're analyzing, is there really a contradiction? But you certainly do not have to have any hechrich to fa'emfer, to try to answer contradictions between Tosfos. Okay, so that's different schools. Again, it's an academic book, but Rav Ephraim Orbach, who was a very, very esteemed professor, historian in Hebrew University, wrote a 2-volume work called Balei HaTosfos. And he actually goes through every single Masechta and tells you which collection of Tosfos is that Masechta based on. Okay? Yeah. Let me go in the back of that, because you had a few turns already. Yeah.
If you look through the history of Torah studies, starting from Moshe Rabbeinu, down to the Tanana Muraim, going to Rishonim, down to half of the Achronim, the Shachtaz and such.
Yeah.
They all study Torah to get to the final, to the practical halachic Hafkamina. And it seems like 150 or 200 years or so ago, it started becoming more towards London and just the learning for understanding the Svara. I want to know what the cutoff point is and why we don't go back to actually studying to the practical halachic.
Yeah, this is a very, very excellent question. It's a very perplexing question. I mean, Chazal themselves say that the ultimate goal of Torah learning is liasuke shmaisa aliba dehilchasa, to conclude your learning, to have a final halacha that you're supposed to paskin. And that's the highest goal of learning. As you say, this certainly is what the Shach, the Taz, the Neisei Kalim of the Shulchan Aruch, the Beis Yosef earlier than that, and really the Vilna Gaon, and even Rav Chaim Volozhiner, who was the founder of the modern yeshiva movement of Volozhin, talked about Lasuke Shmaisa Liba Dehochasa. today, at least in the Litvish yeshivas, we are considered to be the Yorshim of the Litvish yeshivas. The emphasis is on theory, on lumdus, on svara, and if you want to know Halakha, they almost, you're almost embarrassed to ask Halakha. Like Rabbi Yosef described once in I mean, he was, he was sarcastic sometimes, very, very funny. He would say, in Panovich, great Litvish Ashkenazi yeshiva, in Panovich, you want to learn Halacha Lamaisa, you got to lock yourself in a room away from anybody so nobody's going to see you, and then you can learn Halacha as long as nobody discovers you. Once you're discovered, you're going to have to put it away, right? Okay, that's a guzma, but then this is what Roger used to say about Ashkenazi yeshivas. Now the question is this: in theory, there doesn't have to be, and there shouldn't be, a merchak between lumdus and halacha. I mean, one could go into lumdus, one could go into. In fact, the emes is, how can you paskin halacha lemaisa unless you understand all the lumdus? Otherwise, it's superficial. So the notion that lumdus and halacha lemaisa are two different things, which the way they're treated today, is absolutely a false dichotomy. Because true lumdus should be a way to bring you to the halacha, and if you don't have a good grounding in lumdus, I mean, maybe you can memorize the Mishnah Berurah, but you're not going to be able to paskin a new case. You have to understand, when we say somebody's a posek, this is important language. We don't just mean he knows what the Shulchan Aruch and the commentaries say. If all you're doing is retrieving the book, so you have a good memory, and that's a great bracha. But a posek is not somebody who simply retrieves what the Mishnah Berurah says. A posek is somebody who is able to apply, let's say, the Mishnah Berurah or the other sources, to a new situation that's not in the Mishnah Berurah. Now, if you think about that, in order to apply something to a new situation, you have to know the lumdus. If I don't know the lumdus, if I don't know the svaras, I can maybe replicate what is beferish, and that's good too. I mean, ganz fine. Halvai, we should be zoicha to do that, but that's not really being a posek. Being a posek is the ability to apply it to a new situation. So in theory, there should not be a dichotomy between lumdus and psak, but you are correct. You are correct that in recent centuries, maybe 150 years or so, there's been a big departure from de-emphasizing halacha and emphasizing lumdus. Now, why that is so, it's a bit of a mystery. Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky once suggested that it was the Haskalah movement in which so many Jews were attracted to universities because of the theory, because of the chokhmas and the like, that learning had to be packaged in such a way that emphasized theoretical aspects of lumdus, because that was moshech the lave, that pulled people in, that gave them excitement. It was a surrogate for the intellectual attractions of universities. So that's why it developed that way. But it's interesting that was true mainly in the Litvish yeshivas. Now, when we think about yeshivas of Europe, what do we think about? Just name your yeshivas. We think about Mir, Slobodka, Kamenetz, Baranovich, Panovich in Europe. Right? These are called the Litvish yeshivas. They were all located in Lita. But there were other countries. You had Hungarian yeshivas. You had Sephardic yeshivas, Tunisia and Morocco. And it's an interesting thing that the yeshivas in Hungary, the Chazam Sofer, and the yeshivas of Sephardim never abandoned Halakha. It's very, very interesting that they maintained that the tachlis of their learning was Halacha L'maisa, and they integrated it in their yeshiva. So really, the phenomenon you're describing became the phenomenon of the Litvish yeshivas. It was not necessarily the whole yeshiva world. But as I say, we're very tunnel vision. When we say yeshivas, just the yeshiva world, we think Litvish yeshiva, but that was not the totality of the yeshiva world. Yeah.
When we do Kabbalah stuff, the creation of something of life.
Yeah.
Is it just an acknowledgement of something that already exists, or we're also accepting something upon ourselves when we're doing it?
Well, I think the critical word is kabbalas, meaning if you're asking me, does the Metzius of the yoke of heaven exist? The answer is it does, whether you like it or not. So you're not creating the Metzius of Hashem ruling over you. That's the way life is. But the notion of Kabbalah is I pledge myself. I am makabel of my own free will that I make Hashem a melech. And here it's very important. Let me share with you a very important machshava of the Vilna Gaon. The Vilna Gaon makes a difference between two words for a king. One is Moshel, which is a ruler, and one is Melech, which is a king. What is the nafkamina between Moshel and Melech? A Moshel is a dictator who rules over you whether you like it or not. A Melech is someone that is accepted as their sovereign with the Ratzain of the Yam. And therefore, Kabbalas Ol Malchus Shamayim actually means you're taking Hashem that is your Moshel, and you are Makabel him as your Melech. And by the way, this is especially the Avodah of Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah is called the coronation day, the day that we accept and proclaim Hashem as Melech. That's the whole Avodah of Rosh Hashanah. But Kriya Shema, at least we do it twice a day, morning and night. We're Makabel, the Ol of the Malchus Shamayim. Yeah.
Yes, so regarding when the Torah always says that Moshe Rabbeinu spoke to Bnei Israel, right, in the assembly of Bnei Israel, it makes it sound like everyone was able to hear him, right? Do we have anything from Chazal or Midrashim that explain how this happened? If this in fact was the case, everyone heard him all at once, which would be a phenomenal thing.
Yeah, that's a good question. What was the public address system when Moshe Rabbeinu was addressing 3 million people, as it were? How does it work? So, putting aside the book of Devarim for a moment, because this will not be a terrace of book of Devarim, Chazal actually say that when Moshe Rabbeinu spoke, it was the voice of Hashem that came out of Moshe Rabbeinu's mouth, meaning to say, Moshe Rabbeinu, remember, Moshe Rabbeinu himself was kavad peh. Moshe Rabbeinu was a stutterer. Moshe Rabbeinu could not articulate words. The Drashas Aran actually writes, he has different proofs, that Moshe Rabbeinu could not articulate like half of the aleph base. He was so defective in his speech. You couldn't have a conversation with him. But when it came to Torah, he was a conduit for Hashem's voice coming out of him. So it was the voice of Hashem. Now, that raises a very interesting intellectual question that even goes back to Matan Torah. When we say we hear the voice of Hashem, what does that mean exactly? Does that mean we hear a voice, like a loud voice? Or is it an internal hearing? Meaning everybody like hears in their mind the words of God. I don't know. It's possible that it was not necessarily in the nature of an external voice, but an internal voice. Now, the reason why I say my teretz is not a good teretz for the book of Devarim is based on the Gra. The Gra writes that the 4 Chumashim of the Torah is the voice of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but the book of Devarim is the voice of Moshe. He says that's the chiluk between. So then you're back to square one. If it's the voice of Moshe, then, how did people hear it? So I don't know. Did Hashem make Moshe's voice loud, etc.? But it was not. The Gra says it was not the kol of Hakadosh Baruch Hu. Yeah.
The Nefesh HaChaim says that a person's Yirat Shamayim is his Eitzer to leave Torah.
Yeah.
And so the more Yirat Shamayim you have, the bigger the Eitzer. Does that mean that a person with an 80 IQ can only have bigger Fiduciary Torah than someone with 150 IQ? And does that also explain what we're davening for in Shemesrei or Psachli B'Psar Zachar?
Yeah, so again, this is the very famous, important teaching of Rav Chaim Volozhiner, that it's the Yirat Shamayim that a person has, that is the Eitzer, the treasure house, right? A treasure house preserves and protects the wealth that is within. The Yirat Shamayim preserves and protects the Torah that you learn. Without Yirat Shamayim, the Torah is not protected. So the question is, you're asking, what does that mean? Does that mean that the person with Yirat Shamayim, with a relatively lower IQ, will have more Chidushei Torah than the person who's brilliant but doesn't have the same level of Yirat Shamayim? Number one, it might mean that. Yeah, it might mean that, but not necessarily so, because you have to understand that when we talk about the Yirat Shamayim is the Eitzer of the Torah, that refers to a few different things. Number one, Torah is not just knowledge that you have in your brain. Torah elevates you. It's makasher you to Hashem. In that sense, the person without Yirat Shamayim might be brilliant, and he might have all sorts of chidushei Torah. But the Torah is not going to remain within him. It's not going to elevate him. And therefore, sure, the lower IQ with the greater Yirat Shamayim is going to be more makosher to Hashem by his Torah than the person without it. Meaning it's lav dafka in the realm of chidushei Torah. It would seem, however, that legabe yedias haTorah, that will also count. Meaning the Baal Yirat Shamayim will remember more of his Torah. Maybe he won't have chidushim. Okay, not everybody's avodah is to be machadish, right? I mean, our obligation is to learn, and our obligation is to know Torah. There's a mitzvah to know Torah also. So I think in that sense, the Yirat Shamayim will be a preservative. But chidushim, I could very easily see that is the case, but maybe lav dafka. Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, last question.
Torah is portion other places also. Tells us that whenever people go out to war, they shouldn't be afraid. Whenever they go out to war,
Yeah.
when the soldiers go out to war.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because we see that Hashem is commanding us to have a certain emotion, and it's also the elements that comes to mind, like by a low top one. That person is not to be jealous also. God is commanding us to have a certain emotion, not to have a certain emotion. I find it it's very difficult to understand how we could control our emotions and how we could necessarily dictate what we should and we should not be feeling.
Yeah, well, obviously the issue of emotion, love somebody, hate somebody, don't have fear, etc. We think emotions are just there, they're within us, and we cannot control them. The truth of the matter is, even modern psychology says we have a lot more control over emotions than we think we have. If we have the right mental frameworks, the right spiritual preparations, we can at least get involved in a process. Meaning, when the Torah says, don't be afraid, the Torah is not saying, oh, now that you're going into battle, change your emotion. The Torah is giving you a directive that you work on for a long time, before you go to battle, to cultivate a mindset of emunah, bitachon, positivity, optimism, hope. And you develop these midos, so then when you face the difficulties of life, you'll be able to do it in a proper way. I'm sorry, I do have to stop a little early tonight, but maybe well. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this Ohr Somayach production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.